In 1853, the humid air of Charleston, South Carolina, carried whispers that would echo through generations. The case of Clara Bell remains one of the most disturbing mysteries ever documented in the antebellum South, a story that challenged everything the plantation society thought it understood about human nature and the boundaries of the known world. The Magnolia Grove plantation sat 23 miles northwest of Charleston proper, nestled between the Ashley River and a dense grove of live oaks draped in Spanish moss. The estate belonged to Cornelius Whitmore, a man whose wealth came from rice cultivation and whose reputation for treating his enslaved workers with what passed for humanity in those days made him an oddity among his peers. The plantation house, a sprawling Georgian structure with white columns and wraparound porches, commanded a view of endless fields that stretched toward the horizon like a green sea. It was in the autumn of 1853 that Clara Bell arrived at Magnolia Grove under circumstances that would prove to be the first of many inexplicable elements in her story. She had been purchased at the Charleston slave market from a trader named Jeremiah Hooks, a weathered man with tobacco-stained teeth who claimed to have acquired her from a bankrupt estate in Virginia. What made Clara unusual was not just her striking beauty, with skin the color of café au lait and eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge far beyond her apparent age of 19, but her ability to speak fluently in 3 languages that no one could identify or explain. The first language sounded vaguely European, but contained harsh consonants and rolling rhythms that bore no resemblance to any known dialect. The second had a musical quality, with tones that rose and fell like birdsong, yet carried an underlying sadness that made listeners uncomfortable. The third was perhaps the most unsettling, consisting of whispered syllables that seemed to bypass the ear entirely and lodge themselves directly in the mind of whoever heard them. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a physician and amateur linguist who frequently visited the Whitmore plantation, first examined Clara in November of 1853. His notes, discovered years later in the basement of the Charleston Medical College, described her as a specimen of humanity that challenges our understanding of the natural order. He spent hours attempting to classify her speech patterns, consulting every linguistic text available in Charleston's libraries, yet found no correlation to any known language family. What troubled Dr. Hartwell most was not Clara's unusual linguistic abilities, but her apparent lack of memory regarding how she had acquired these languages. When questioned about her past, she would respond in perfect English, claiming she could not remember learning any of the 3 mysterious tongues. She insisted they simply existed within her, like breathing or the beating of her heart. More disturbing still were the occasions when she would begin speaking in one of the unknown languages without seeming to realize it, her eyes taking on a distant quality, as if she were listening to voices only she could hear. Margaret Whitmore, Cornelius's wife, initially found Clara's presence comforting. The young woman possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate needs, appearing with cool water on hot days before being summoned, or bringing a shawl to the veranda just as evening chill began to set in. Clara moved through the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who had always belonged there, yet there was something in her manner that suggested she was constantly listening for something others could not hear. The first sign that Clara's presence might be more complicated than anyone imagined came during the Christmas season of 1853. The plantation's elderly cook, a woman named Bessie, who had been born on Magnolia Grove and knew every family secret spanning 3 generations, began complaining of nightmares. She described dreams where she would wake in the middle of the night to find Clara standing at the foot of her bed, speaking in one of her unknown languages while tears streamed down her face. When Bessie would blink or try to respond, Clara would be gone, leaving only the lingering echo of words that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Other enslaved workers began reporting similar experiences. They would catch glimpses of Clara in places where she could not possibly be, speaking to empty rooms or having animated conversations with invisible companions. Samuel, the plantation's blacksmith, claimed he had seen her in the woods at dawn, kneeling beside the old cemetery where the previous owners had buried their family members, her lips moving in what appeared to be prayer. Though the words belonged to none of her 3 mysterious languages, these reports might have been dismissed as the product of overwrought imaginations were it not for the physical evidence that began accumulating. Strange symbols appeared carved into the bark of trees throughout the plantation grounds, symbols that bore no resemblance to any writing system known to the educated men who examined them. The carvings were discovered in a perfect circle around the slave quarters, each symbol different yet somehow connected, as if they formed a message that could only be understood when viewed as a whole. Dr. Hartwell became obsessed with documenting these symbols, creating detailed sketches that he sent to colleagues in Boston, New York, and even London. The responses were unanimous in their bewilderment. Professor William Blackwood of Harvard University wrote that the symbols appeared to be a corruption of ancient scripts, yet possessing an internal logic that suggests genuine linguistic structure rather than random markings. As winter deepened into 1854, Clara's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would disappear for hours at a time, only to be found standing motionless in the plantation's library, staring at books written in languages she claimed not to understand. When questioned about these episodes, she would respond with confusion, insisting she had no memory of leaving her quarters. Margaret Whitmore began keeping a daily journal of Clara's activities, noting that the young woman seemed to exist in 2 states, one where she was the perfect servant, attentive and capable, and another where she appeared to be sleepwalking through conversations with invisible presences. The breaking point came on a February evening when the temperature had dropped below freezing, unusual for the Carolina Low Country. Cornelius Whitmore discovered Clara in the plantation's chapel, a small building that had been constructed by his grandfather and rarely used since Margaret preferred attending services in Charleston. Clara was kneeling before the altar, her lips moving rapidly in the 3rd of her unknown languages, the one that seemed to bypass normal hearing. But what froze Whitmore's blood was not the sight of her unauthorized presence in the sacred space, but the fact that every candle in the chapel had been lit, despite the building having been locked since the previous Sunday's service. When Cornelius called out to her, Clara turned slowly, and for a moment he later wrote in a letter to his brother. Her eyes held no recognition of him or her surroundings. She continued speaking in the unknown language for several more moments before seeming to return to herself, at which point she began weeping uncontrollably and begging forgiveness for trespassing in the chapel. She claimed to have no memory of entering the building or lighting the candles. Dr. Hartwell was summoned the following morning to examine Clara once again. His second set of notes, more detailed than the first, revealed his growing concern about her mental state. He described periods where she would speak normally for hours, discussing mundane household matters with perfect lucidity, followed by episodes where she seemed to slip into another consciousness entirely. During these episodes, she would speak exclusively in her unknown languages, often gesturing as if responding to questions or commands from invisible speakers. Most troubling to Dr. Hartwell were the physical changes he observed during these episodes. Clara's posture would alter, becoming more rigid and formal, as if she were participating in some kind of ceremony or ritual. Her breathing would slow to an almost imperceptible rate, and her skin would take on a peculiar pallor that made her appear almost translucent in certain light. These physical transformations were documented in detail, with Dr. Hartwell noting that they occurred with mathematical regularity, typically beginning at sunset and lasting until just before dawn. The mystery of Clara's origins deepened when Jeremiah Hooks, the slave trader who had sold her to Cornelius Whitmore, was found dead in his Charleston boarding house in March of 1854. The circumstances of his death were unremarkable. Officially attributed to heart failure brought on by excessive drinking, but among his personal effects was a leather-bound journal that told a different story about Clara's acquisition. According to Hooks's journal, Clara had not been purchased from a bankrupt Virginia estate, as he had claimed. Instead, she had been found wandering alone on a remote road outside Savannah, Georgia, wearing a torn white dress and speaking only in her 3 unknown languages. She carried no identification, no personal belongings, and seemed to have no memory of how she had come to be on that road. Local authorities had held her for several weeks, during which time she gradually began speaking English, though she remained unable to explain her past or the origin of her mysterious linguistic abilities. Hooks had acquired Clara through unofficial channels, purchasing her from a local magistrate who was eager to resolve the problem of an unidentified woman with no legal status in a society where every person of color was required to have documentation proving their enslaved or free status. The journal entries revealed that Hooks himself had been disturbed by Clara's behavior during their journey to Charleston, noting that she would often engage in long conversations with invisible companions and seemed to possess an uncanny ability to predict weather changes and other natural phenomena. More troubling still were Hooks's observations about the effect Clara seemed to have on others. Fellow travelers would complain of vivid nightmares after spending time near her, and animals showed unusual behavior in her presence. Horses would become agitated and refuse to approach her, while dogs would whine and retreat to the farthest possible distance. Birds would fall silent when she passed, and even insects seemed to avoid the area around her. As spring arrived at Magnolia Grove, the situation with Clara reached a crisis point. Margaret Whitmore's journal entries from this period reveal a household in chaos, with servants reporting increasingly strange phenomena and requesting transfers to other plantations. The unknown symbols that had been carved into trees began appearing on the walls of the slave quarters, scratched into the wood during the night by unknown hands. Several enslaved workers claimed to have seen Clara creating these markings, but when confronted, she would deny any knowledge of them and appear genuinely distressed by their presence. Dr. Hartwell's final examination of Clara took place in April of 1854, and his notes from this session reveal a man grappling with phenomena that challenged his understanding of human nature. He described Clara as existing in a state of constant internal conflict, as if multiple personalities or consciousnesses were struggling for control of her body. During their conversation, she would switch between her normal speaking voice and what he termed the voice of the languages, a deeper, more resonant tone that seemed to come from somewhere other than her throat. Perhaps most disturbing was Dr. Hartwell's observation that Clara seemed to be aging rapidly during these episodes. Her hair, which had been lustrous and dark, was developing streaks of premature grey, and her skin was beginning to show lines that belonged on a much older face. He theorized that whatever force was speaking through her was consuming her physical essence, though he acknowledged that such an explanation defied all medical understanding of the time. The end came suddenly and without warning on a May morning when the dogwoods were in full bloom and the air was sweet with the scent of jasmine. Clara simply vanished from Magnolia Grove sometime during the night, leaving behind only the white dress she had worn since her arrival and a final message carved into the oak tree outside her quarters. The message was written in all 3 of her unknown languages, arranged in concentric circles around the trunk of the tree, but no one at the plantation could decipher its meaning. Cornelius Whitmore organized search parties that scoured the surrounding countryside for days, but no trace of Clara was ever found. The bloodhounds that had been brought in to track her scent would follow a trail that led to the Ashley River and then simply stopped, as if she had vanished into thin air. Local authorities were notified, but without a clear description of her legal status or ownership history, there was little they could do beyond filing a routine report. In the months following Clara's disappearance, life at Magnolia Grove slowly returned to what passed for normal, though the strange symbols carved into the trees remained visible for years, slowly growing over with bark but never completely disappearing. Margaret Whitmore's journals from this period reveal a woman struggling to understand what had transpired in her household, questioning whether Clara had been entirely human or something else entirely. Dr. Hartwell continued his research into Clara's case for several more years, corresponding with linguists and scholars across the country in an attempt to identify her 3 languages. He never found satisfactory answers, though one professor at Yale suggested that the languages might represent a form of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, though he acknowledged that Clara's consistent pronunciation and apparent comprehension of what she was saying challenged this explanation. The most unsettling development came in 1857, 3 years after Clara's disappearance, when Dr. Hartwell received a letter from a colleague in New Orleans describing a remarkably similar case. A young woman of mixed ancestry had appeared at a convent there, speaking 3 unidentified languages and displaying behavior patterns identical to Clara's. The woman had given her name as Bell Clara and claimed to have no memory of her past, though the nuns noted that she seemed to possess knowledge of religious rituals from traditions they could not identify. Dr. Hartwell traveled to New Orleans to investigate this new case, but by the time he arrived, the woman had once again vanished, leaving behind only carved symbols and the lingering memory of languages that belonged to no known culture. His investigation revealed similar cases in Mobile, Alabama and Natchez, Mississippi, suggesting that whatever Clara represented was not isolated to the Carolinas. The final documented sighting of someone matching Clara's description came from a riverboat captain named Jonas Fletcher, who reported encountering a woman answering her description near the mouth of the Mississippi River in 1859. According to Fletcher's account, filed with the New Orleans Port Authority, the woman had appeared on his vessel during the night, speaking in an unknown language to passengers who claimed not to remember the encounter the following morning. She had disembarked at a remote landing, walking into the swamplands and disappearing into the mist. By 1860, as the country moved inexorably towards civil war, the case of Clara Bell had faded from immediate memory, though it continued to fascinate scholars and amateur investigators. Dr. Hartwell's collected notes and correspondence were donated to the Charleston Medical College upon his death in 1868, where they remained largely forgotten until their rediscovery during renovations in 1957. The renovation project uncovered not only Dr. Hartwell's extensive documentation, but also a collection of daguerreotypes that had been taken of Clara during her time at Magnolia Grove. These images, among the earliest photographic documentation of the case, revealed details that had not been apparent in written accounts. In several of the photographs, Clara's shadow appeared distorted, falling at angles that did not match the position of the sun or artificial lighting. In others, her reflection in mirrors and windows seemed to show a different person entirely, though the identity of this other figure remained unclear. Perhaps most disturbing was a photograph taken in the plantation's library, where Clara could be seen reading a book, while her reflection in a nearby window showed her mouth open as if speaking, though the original image showed her lips closed in concentration. These photographic anomalies defied explanation and added another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable case. The Magnolia Grove plantation itself met its end during the Civil War, when it was burned by Union forces in 1865. Local accounts suggest that the fire started spontaneously in the area where Clara's quarters had been located, though no enemy soldiers were reported in the immediate vicinity at the time. The flames consumed the entire complex within hours, leaving only the foundation stones and the oak tree where Clara's final message had been carved. For decades after the war, the ruins of Magnolia Grove remained abandoned, though local residents reported strange occurrences in the area. Hunters and travelers passing through the region would sometimes hear voices speaking in unknown languages, echoing through the empty landscape on still nights. Several attempts to rebuild on the property failed when construction workers reported tools disappearing and strange symbols appearing in freshly poured concrete. The most comprehensive investigation into the Clara Bell case was undertaken by Professor Marcus Thornfield of the University of South Carolina in 1928. Professor Thornfield had become interested in the case while researching antebellum folklore and spent several years collecting testimonies from elderly residents who remembered the original events or had heard accounts from their parents and grandparents. Thornfield's research revealed that similar cases had been documented throughout the American South during the 1850s, suggesting that Clara Bell was part of a larger phenomenon that had never been fully understood or explained. His interviews with descendants of Magnolia Grove's enslaved workers provided additional details about Clara's behavior and the effect she had on those around her. According to these oral histories, Clara had been able to predict natural disasters with uncanny accuracy, warning of storms and floods days before they occurred. She had also demonstrated an ability to locate lost objects and missing persons, though she claimed these insights came to her in dreams spoken in her unknown languages. Most unsettling was the testimony of several elderly residents who claimed their grandparents had told them that Clara could see and speak with people who had been dead for years. Professor Thornfield's investigation was abruptly terminated in 1931 when he disappeared while conducting research at the former Magnolia Grove site. His research notes and collected testimonies were found in his hotel room in Charleston, arranged neatly on his desk as if he had intended to return and continue his work. A search of the plantation ruins revealed no trace of the professor, though local authorities noted that new symbols had appeared carved into the surviving oak tree, symbols that matched those documented in Dr. Hartwell's original notes. The final piece of documented evidence in the Clara Bell case emerged in 1943 when the Charleston Historical Society received a donation of papers from the estate of a deceased collector. Among these documents was a letter dated 1855, written by a Spanish missionary who had encountered a woman matching Clara's description in the remote mountains of northern Mexico. The missionary described the woman as speaking 3 unknown languages and possessing knowledge of religious ceremonies that predated European contact with the Americas. According to the missionary's account, local indigenous communities regarded the woman with a mixture of reverence and fear, claiming she was a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. The woman had remained in the region for several months, during which time several unexplained phenomena had occurred, including the spontaneous healing of chronic illnesses and the appearance of previously unknown plant species that seemed to grow only in her presence. The missionary's letter ended with a troubling observation that the woman seemed to be growing younger rather than older during her stay, as if proximity to the indigenous spiritual traditions was reversing whatever process had been aging her during her time in South Carolina. She had eventually disappeared during a winter storm, walking into a blizzard that should have been fatal, but leaving tracks that led to a cliff face and then simply ended as if she had stepped through solid rock. Today, more than a century and a half after Clara Bell first appeared at the Charleston slave market, her case remains one of the most enigmatic mysteries in American historical records. The 3 languages she spoke have never been identified, despite advances in linguistic science that should have made classification possible. The symbols she carved continue to defy translation, though they have been found at locations across the American South and into Mexico, suggesting a pattern or message that spans vast geographical distances. The question that haunts researchers is not just who Clara Bell was, but what she represented. Was she a victim of some unknown form of psychological disorder that manifested in linguistic hallucinations? Was she part of a cultural tradition so ancient and isolated that it left no other traces in the historical record? Or was she something else entirely, something that challenged the very boundaries of what we consider possible within the natural world? The ruins of Magnolia Grove remain abandoned to this day, though the property has changed hands numerous times over the decades. Each attempt to develop the land has failed under mysterious circumstances, with construction equipment malfunctioning, workers reporting strange voices in the night, and new symbols appearing on any structure that remains standing for more than a few days. Local residents have long since abandoned any attempts to explain these phenomena, accepting them as simply another inexplicable aspect of a story that has no satisfactory ending. In recent years, linguistic anthropologists have theorized that Clara's 3 languages might represent corrupted forms of ancient communication systems, possibly preserved through oral tradition in isolated communities and mixed together in her mind through trauma or psychological dissociation. This explanation accounts for the apparent structure and consistency of her speech patterns, while avoiding the more supernatural implications of her case. However, this theory fails to address the physical evidence that accompanied Clara's presence. The carved symbols, the photographic anomalies, and the consistent reports of phenomena that extended far beyond anything that could be attributed to mental illness or cultural preservation. The case of Clara Bell remains a reminder that there are aspects of human experience that resist easy categorization or rational explanation. The last recorded mention of anything connected to Clara Bell appeared in a 1962 police report from Beaufort County, South Carolina. A night security guard at a museum housing Civil War artifacts reported hearing voices speaking in unknown languages coming from the exhibit area during his rounds. When he investigated, he found nothing disturbed, but noted that several items in the antebellum household display had been rearranged in patterns that formed symbols matching those documented in the Clara Bell case files. The guard's report was filed and forgotten, as such reports had been for more than a century. But for those who study the case, it serves as a reminder that some mysteries refuse to remain buried in the past. Whether Clara Bell was a victim of circumstances beyond her control, a guardian of ancient knowledge, or something else entirely, her story continues to echo through the quiet places of the American South, carried on whispers in languages that no one can understand, but everyone somehow remembers. The truth about Clara Bell may never be known, lost somewhere between documented history and the realm of possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of accepted reality. Her case stands as a testament to the limits of human understanding and the persistence of mystery in a world that believes it has explained everything. In the end, perhaps that is Clara's true legacy, not the solution to her puzzle, but the reminder that some questions are more important than their answers, and some stories are meant to remain unfinished, echoing through time like voices speaking in languages we will never understand. The truth about Clara Bell may never be known, lost somewhere between documented history and the realm of possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of accepted reality. Her case stands as a testament to the limits of human understanding and the persistence of mystery in a world that believes it has explained everything. In the end, perhaps that is Clara's true legacy, not the solution to her puzzle, but the reminder that some questions are more important than their answers, and some stories are meant to remain unfinished, echoing through time, like voices speaking in languages we will never understand. Yet the story of Clara Bell did not end with scholarly speculation or abandoned investigations. In 1968, during the height of the civil rights movement, a construction crew working on a highway expansion project near the former Magnolia Grove site made a discovery that would add one final, disturbing chapter to her legend. The workers had been excavating the foundation for a bridge when their equipment struck something solid beneath layers of river silt and decades of accumulated debris. What they uncovered was a stone chamber, perfectly preserved despite being buried for over a century. The chamber walls were covered with the same symbols that had appeared throughout Clara's documented history, but these were not carved hastily into bark or scratched into walls during moments of distress. These symbols had been carefully etched into the stone with precision and deliberation, arranged in patterns that suggested they formed a complete narrative or instruction manual. The discovery was initially reported to the South Carolina Department of Transportation as a potential archaeological site that might delay construction. However, when state archaeologist Dr. Patricia Morrison examined the chamber, she immediately recognized the symbols from historical accounts of the Clara Bell case. Her preliminary report, filed with the State Historical Commission, described the find as unprecedented in its implications for our understanding of antebellum Southern history and possibly much older cultural traditions. Dr. Morrison's team spent 6 weeks documenting the chamber before construction pressures forced them to complete their work hastily. Their findings, classified and sealed for reasons that were never publicly explained, reportedly included evidence that the chamber had been occupied within the past century. Personal artifacts found within the space included fragments of white cotton fabric consistent with the dress Clara had worn at Magnolia Grove, strands of hair that matched descriptions of her appearance, and a collection of small bones that appeared to be from various animals, but had been arranged in patterns that corresponded to the carved symbols. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be a journal written in 3 distinct scripts that matched no known writing systems. The pages, made from a paper that could not be dated using conventional methods, contained detailed drawings of plants and animals that did not match any species native to the Carolina region. Several drawings depicted human figures engaged in ceremonies or rituals that involved the arrangement of symbols identical to those found throughout Clara's case history. The journal also contained what appeared to be maps showing locations across the American South, marked with symbols that corresponded to documented sightings of Clara or similar mysterious figures. These maps suggested a network of sites spanning from Virginia to Texas, connected by routes that followed major rivers and ancient tribal migration paths. Each marked location corresponded to historical accounts of unexplained phenomena dating back to the early days of European settlement. Before Dr. Morrison's team could complete their analysis, the chamber was sealed and filled with concrete on direct orders from the federal government. The official explanation cited safety concerns related to structural instability, but workers on the project later reported that the decision came after several team members began experiencing the same phenomena that had plagued those who encountered Clara. Vivid nightmares, episodes of speaking in unknown languages, and the appearance of mysterious symbols in their personal belongings. Dr. Morrison herself vanished 3 months after the chamber was sealed, disappearing from her hotel room in Atlanta while attending a conference on southeastern archaeology. Her research notes and photographs of the chamber artifacts were never recovered, and no trace of her was ever found despite extensive searches. The official investigation concluded that she had suffered a psychological breakdown related to work stress and had likely left the state voluntarily, though colleagues insisted this explanation was inconsistent with her character and professional dedication. The sealing of the chamber might have marked the end of the Clara Bell mystery, were it not for the persistence of Dr. Morrison's research assistant, a graduate student named Michael Torres, who had been documenting the team's findings as part of his dissertation research. Torres had maintained his own copies of key photographs and measurements, hidden away when it became clear that the official investigation was being terminated prematurely. In 1971, Torres published a limited edition academic paper titled Anomalous Archaeological Evidence from the Ashley River Basin in a small anthropological journal. The paper carefully avoided mentioning Clara Bell by name, instead presenting the chamber discovery as evidence of previously unknown cultural practices among pre-Columbian indigenous populations. However, those familiar with the case could easily recognize the connections Torres was drawing between the archaeological evidence and historical accounts of unexplained phenomena. Torres's paper attracted little attention from mainstream academic circles, but it did reach several researchers who had been independently investigating similar cases across the American South. Dr. Helen Vasquez of Tulane University had been documenting oral histories from Louisiana communities that included accounts of mysterious women who spoke unknown languages and left behind unexplained symbols. Professor James Whitfield of the University of Alabama had collected similar stories from rural areas throughout the Deep South, noting patterns that suggested these were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger phenomenon that had persisted for generations. These researchers began corresponding with Torres, sharing their findings and gradually piecing together what appeared to be a comprehensive map of locations where Clara-like figures had been reported throughout American history. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and deeply troubling. The appearances seemed to cluster around times of social upheaval and cultural transition, as if these mysterious figures were somehow connected to periods when the established order was being challenged or transformed. The most recent documented case came from Dr. Vasquez's research in the Louisiana Bayou country, where elderly residents of an isolated Creole community described encounters with a woman who matched Clara's description during the early days of the civil rights movement. According to these accounts, the woman had appeared during a period of racial tension in 1964, speaking to community members in languages they could not identify but somehow understood. Her presence had reportedly coincided with the peaceful resolution of several conflicts that had threatened to erupt into violence, though no one could explain exactly how her intervention had been effective. The community members described the woman as ageless and otherworldly, possessing knowledge of local history that extended back generations and an ability to see connections between events that others missed. She had remained in the area for several months, during which time the carved symbols that had become her signature began appearing on trees and buildings throughout the community. When civil rights workers arrived to help organize voter registration drives, they found a population that was unusually unified and determined, as if some fundamental shift in consciousness had occurred. Dr. Vasquez's attempts to interview the woman directly were unsuccessful, as she had disappeared shortly before the researchers' arrival in the community. However, the symbols she left behind were identical to those documented in the Clara Bell case, suggesting that either the same individual had somehow survived for over a century, or that multiple people possessing similar abilities were connected by some larger pattern or purpose. The collaboration between Torres, Vasquez, and Whitfield continued throughout the 1970s, Though their work was hampered by the reluctance of academic institutions to support research into phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of history and human behavior. Their findings were published in obscure journals and presented at conferences that attracted more curiosity seekers than serious scholars, gradually relegating their work to the margins of academic discourse. However, their research did attract the attention of certain government agencies that maintained files on unexplained phenomena. Declassified documents from the 1980s reveal that federal investigators had been monitoring reports of Clara-like figures since the early 20th century, treating them as potential security risks due to their apparent ability to influence social and political situations in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. These government files, released through Freedom of Information Act requests in the 1990s, contain hundreds of reports spanning nearly a century of sightings and encounters. The documents describe a consistent pattern: mysterious women appearing in communities during times of crisis, speaking unknown languages, leaving behind symbolic markings, and disappearing without explanation after helping to resolve conflicts or guide communities through difficult transitions. Perhaps most intriguing are the psychological profiles contained within these files, which describe the subjects as exhibiting characteristics that suggest they exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously. Government psychologists theorize that these individuals might represent some form of evolutionary adaptation to social stress, developing abilities that allowed them to serve as bridges between conflicting groups or competing worldviews. The files also contain references to attempts by various agencies to locate and study these individuals, efforts that were consistently unsuccessful despite significant resources being devoted to the task. In every case, the subjects seemed to anticipate surveillance efforts and would disappear before contact could be established, leaving behind only the enigmatic symbols that had become their calling card. The most recent entry in the declassified files dates to 1987 and describes an encounter near the Tennessee-Kentucky border where a woman matching the established profile had appeared during a labor dispute that threatened to erupt into violence. Workers and management representatives reported that the woman had somehow facilitated negotiations that led to a peaceful resolution, though no one could explain exactly what role she had played in the process. As the 20th century drew to a close, academic interest in the Clara Bell case experienced a brief revival when advances in computer technology allowed researchers to analyze the symbolic patterns she had left behind using sophisticated pattern recognition software. Dr. Sarah Chen of MIT's Artificial Intelligence Laboratory applied machine learning algorithms to digitized images of Clara's symbols, hoping to identify underlying linguistic structures that might reveal their meaning or origin. Chen's analysis revealed that the symbols possessed mathematical properties that suggested they represented a form of communication far more complex than simple pictographic writing. The patterns contained recursive elements and self-referential structures that indicated a level of abstract thinking typically associated with advanced mathematical concepts. Most remarkably, when analyzed as a complete system, the symbols seem to describe relationships between temporal states, as if they were instructions for navigating different periods of time or alternate versions of reality. These findings attracted brief attention from the scientific community, but efforts to replicate Chen's results were unsuccessful when the original symbol images were discovered to have been corrupted in the digitization process. The backup copies that had been stored at various institutions showed subtle but significant differences from the originals, as if the symbols themselves resisted accurate reproduction through technological means. Dr. Chen's research came to an abrupt end when she began experiencing the same phenomena that had affected others who studied Clara's case too closely. She reported dreams where she found herself speaking unknown languages and waking to discover that she had carved symbols into her apartment walls during the night. After several weeks of increasingly disturbing episodes, she abandoned her research and requested a transfer to a different department, refusing to discuss her findings with colleagues. The dawn of the 21st century brought new technologies and analytical methods to the study of historical mysteries, but the Clara Bell case seemed to resist every attempt at modern investigation. DNA analysis of hair samples allegedly taken from the various sites where she had appeared yielded inconsistent results, with different laboratories reporting genetic profiles that bore no relationship to each other or to any known human population groups. Digital enhancement of the historical photographs revealed increasingly strange anomalies the more closely they were examined. Computer analysis suggested that Clara's image had been somehow superimposed over different backgrounds, as if she existed independently of the physical spaces where she appeared. Most disturbing was the discovery that her reflection in mirrors and windows showed different clothing and even different facial features than her direct image, suggesting that the photographs were capturing multiple temporal states simultaneously. The most recent attempt to solve the Clara Bell mystery was undertaken by investigative journalist Maria Santos, who spent 3 years researching the case for a documentary film that was never completed. Santos had obtained access to previously classified government files and had interviewed descendants of families who claimed to have encountered Clara or similar figures throughout American history. Santos's investigation led her to a startling conclusion. Clara Bell was not a single individual, but rather a manifestation of something much larger and more complex. According to her theory, the various women who had appeared throughout American history, speaking unknown languages, were all aspects of the same phenomenon, a kind of temporal guardian that emerged during periods when the social fabric was being torn apart by conflict and change. Santos theorized that Clara represented a form of collective unconscious that became manifest during times of crisis, drawing on ancient knowledge and communication systems to help guide communities through difficult transitions. The unknown languages she spoke were not foreign tongues, but rather forms of communication that bypassed normal linguistic processing and spoke directly to deeper levels of human consciousness. This theory explained why Clara's presence was associated with the peaceful resolution of conflicts, and why those who encountered her often reported feeling a sense of clarity and understanding that they could not rationally explain. It also accounted for the temporal anomalies surrounding her appearances, as a phenomenon existing partially outside normal time would naturally exhibit characteristics that seemed to defy conventional understanding of cause and effect. Santos's investigation was terminated when she disappeared while researching at the original Magnolia Grove site in 2003. Her research notes and video footage were found in her rental car, parked beside the old oak tree where Clara's final message had been carved nearly a century and a half earlier. The tree itself had died sometime during the previous decade, but new symbols had recently appeared carved into its dead trunk, symbols that matched those documented throughout Clara's history but showed no signs of weathering, despite the tree's deteriorated condition. The final entry in Santos's notebook contained a single sentence written in 3 different scripts that corresponded to no known writing system, a message that remained as mysterious and untranslatable as everything else connected to the Clara Bell case. Below this message, Santos had written a single line in English: "Some doors should remain closed, but some voices must be heard." Today, the Clara Bell case remains officially unsolved and largely forgotten by mainstream historians and researchers. The site where Magnolia Grove once stood has been designated as protected wetlands, preventing any further archaeological investigation. The dead oak tree where Clara's symbols continue to appear, has been fenced off by local authorities, who cite safety concerns but acknowledge they cannot explain why new carvings continue to appear on dead wood that should be incapable of holding such markings. Local residents avoid the area, especially during times of social tension or community conflict, when strange voices speaking unknown languages can sometimes be heard echoing across the empty landscape. These reports are dismissed by authorities as the product of overactive imaginations and local folklore, but they persist generation after generation, suggesting that whatever Clara Bell represented has not entirely disappeared from the American consciousness. The 3 languages she spoke remain unidentified, despite advances in linguistic science that should have made classification routine. The symbols she left behind continue to defy translation, though they have inspired artists and writers who claim they convey meaning that transcends normal communication. Most mysteriously, people who spend time studying her case often report dreams where they find themselves speaking in tongues that feel familiar despite being impossible to understand upon waking. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Clara Bell's legacy is not what she represented, but what she reveals about the limitations of human understanding when confronted with phenomena that exist beyond the boundaries of accepted reality. Her case demonstrates that there are aspects of human experience that resist categorization, analysis, and rational explanation, no matter how sophisticated our investigative methods become. The mystery of Clara Bell serves as a reminder that the world contains depths of strangeness that our ancestors accepted as natural parts of existence, but that our modern sensibilities struggle to acknowledge. Whether she was a victim of unknown psychological conditions, a guardian of ancient wisdom, or something else entirely, her story continues to challenge our assumptions about the nature of reality and the limits of human possibility. In the end, Clara Bell's greatest mystery may not be who she was or where she came from, but why her story continues to resonate with people across generations and cultures who have never heard her unknown languages, but somehow recognize the truth they contain. Her case stands as testament to the persistence of mystery in a world that believes it has explained everything, a reminder that some questions transcend the need for answers, and some voices speak truths that can only be understood by those willing to listen with more than their ears. The sounds that still echo across the ruins of Magnolia Grove on quiet nights serve as Clara's final message. That understanding comes not from solving mysteries, but from accepting that mystery itself is an essential part of the human experience. Her 3 unknown languages continue to whisper through the Spanish moss and cypress trees, carrying messages that bypass rational thought and speak directly to something deeper than consciousness. Something that remembers what it means to be truly human in a world that has forgotten how to listen to its own deepest voices.